And thanks for the invitation to be here. Well, I'll tell you the one-sentence version of the book to save you the trouble of reading it. It's basically that if we want to change the world, if we want to transform the reality around us, then what we need isn't data or facts or evidence, but instead it's stories. Now, this isn't news to lots of you in this room because you're campaigners, but it was quite a shock to me because I spent the last 20 years of my life wishing I were this guy. This is Josh Lyman from the West Wing. And I was your archetypal policy wonk. I like pie charts and statistics. I'm very happy putting together 20-page PDF reports. This is my comfort zone. And my underlying theory of change here was that if you got the right evidence and put it in front of the right policymakers, then change would naturally follow. Well, I don't think that anymore. One reason why is this wonderful piece of research. This is from the World Bank. And they got their researchers to research the specific question of what their research was actually achieving and who was reading it. The answer, it turns out, is nobody. 31% of their reports never get downloaded by anybody. I don't know how they managed to continue with the will to live after this. Somehow they carried on. But for me, the epiphany about why facts and data and all this technocracy doesn't change the world came here at United Nations headquarters back in the year 2011. And I was in a room, I still remember it, it's such a depressing thought, surrounded by various members of the great and the good. This group of people, the Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability. You can see Susan Rice up there, who was Obama's national security advisor, Kevin Rudd, the Australian foreign minister, Jairam Ramesh, the Indian environment minister, and various other luminaries. And this was a panel that Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General, had put together to come up with big ideas for the 2012 Global Sustainability Summit that was due to happen in Rio. And if you're wondering what I was doing in the room, well, I was the report's writer. I was the person who was charged with finding the right words to express the collective visions and soaring aspirations of this group of people. And I have to explain at this point, this was my dream job. I'd felt for years that if you got a really heavy-hitting group of policymakers and you took them out of the day-to-day melee of crisis management and firefighting and gave them space to ask really big questions, then naturally they would come up with big answers. And not only that, but they would be willing to go out and really be a force to champion those big answers and bring them to reality in the world. But as I sat there that afternoon in 2011 and listened to the discussion, I had the horrible dawning realization that not only was this group not going to come up with big answers, they were barely willing to acknowledge the big questions in the first place. Instead, what I saw was a perfect example of the G0, which is Ian Bremmer's term for a world in which you don't have any leaders who are really willing to show vision or rise above their narrow national interests. And as my naivety about the power of facts and evidence to change the world fell away, it left me with this big question. Well, if facts and evidence don't change the world, then what does? Well, I thought about that question a lot in the next 5 years, especially after my family and I moved here to Ethiopia. Because suddenly, all these issues I've been writing research about for so long, things like climate change, or droughts, or food security crises, were staring me right in the face. Not as statistics, but as real people with real stories of real hardship. And suddenly it all felt a lot more tangible. And I thought about it as well, this question of what happens when evidence and arguments aren't enough, watching these two clowns triumph from afar. In both cases, you had opposition campaigns, Hillary Clinton against him, the Remain campaign against him on the Brexit referendum, running with very data-driven, insidery, facts-led campaigns. Anyone who followed Brexit remembers the infamous claim that Brexit would save £350 million a week, which we could spend on health provision. And all the progressives were like, it's not true, and we've got the facts to prove it. But it turned out that didn't matter at all, because these guys had great stories. Not nice stories, but extremely resonant ones. Stories about some shadowy other that threatens to overwhelm us. Stories about taking back control in the case of Nigel Farage, or of the need to build bigger walls in the case of Donald Trump. And as I listened to these awful negative stories overwhelming the well-intentioned facts of the kind of progressive side of the argument, I realized I had a bit of a sense of déjà vu from my home issue, which is climate change. If you cast your minds back to around 2008, climate activism was very much the same kind of thing. It was data-driven. It felt like, well, we've got the science on our side, and that's going to be enough to win the argument. And it looked like that theory of change was doing pretty well. If you remember the 2008 presidential election, it was fought between two candidates who, despite their different points on the political spectrum, both agreed that climate change was real, that it was caused by humans, and that it was absolutely urgent to do something about it. And better yet, by the following spring, in 2009, the House of Representatives had passed the US's first climate legislation. All that needed to happen now was for the bill to clear the Senate, which was assumed to be a mere formality, and then it would set the stage beautifully for that winter's Copenhagen Climate Change Summit. Unfortunately, no one had noticed these guys emerging in the grassroots all around the country, the Tea Party. And what they did over the summer was they spent the whole time going to senators' town hall meetings, and as one climate writer put it at the time, generally scaring the bejesus out of Republican legislators. So by the time the Senate came back from its summer break, any prospects for US climate legislation had absolutely fallen apart. And a few months after that, the Copenhagen summit fell apart too, without any kind of binding global deal. I remember the feeling of shock and disarray among climate activists at the time. And some of the NGOs commissioned Theda Skocpol, a very eminent political scientist at Harvard, to write a report and explain what the hell just happened. And her answer to them, in a nutshell, was that the Tea Party played an outsider, values-led, insurgent game against the NGO's insider, technocratic, facts-led campaign, and it basically ran over them with a tank. And that's why we didn't get a binding deal at Copenhagen. But here's the good part. Climate activists, after that terrible defeat, got smart. They realized they had to take a leaf out of the Tea Party's book and build a movement if they were going to overcome this kind of opposition. And that's exactly what they did. If you fast forward to here, summer of 2014, you find 500,000 people on the streets of New York demanding serious global action on climate change. Or activists taking over Germany's largest coal mine and actually shutting down production while they occupied it. Or taking to the sea in a flotilla of kayaks to prevent oil rigs from being towed out to the Pacific. Even a whole papal encyclical about climate change, something almost couldn't have imagined happening 5 years previously. And to cap it all, activists in a stunned state of euphoria here in Paris that winter, when the Paris Climate Summit succeeded where Copenhagen had failed, with a global deal for eliminating carbon dioxide emissions from energy by 2050 and a target of limiting global warming to just 1.5 degrees. So how did the climate activists do it? How did they engineer this extraordinary reversal of fortunes? Well, most of all, I would argue it's because they reinvented themselves as storytellers, as myth makers. Now, let me take a second here to step back and ask, well, what is it that we mean by a myth? Well, once upon a time, there was a particular sort of story, deep story, that our societies shared. These were stories about where we are, how we got here, where we might be trying to get to, and underneath it all, the question of who we are. Stories that really bound us together as societies. Some of these stories were religious in nature, and some of them were about heroes and quests. But all of them, in their different ways, had very deep truths to teach us. Truths about identity and purpose and belonging. Truths about grief and guilt and redemption. Really quite deep psychological themes. But then if you come to where we are today, we don't really have those shared myths in the same way. And part of the reason why is because in our modern scientific mindset, we think things are either literally true or they're not true at all. So when we talk about myth, like as not, we're probably talking about an urban myth, which means something that's wrong. If you look up myth in the thesaurus, You find it in the same entry as the word fabrication and other words like bunk and crock. So we don't really respect the idea that we need myths to hold us together. Instead, that leaves us in what, as Misha said, Jonas Sachs calls the idea of a myth gap, that we no longer have these shared stories. So what do we have instead? Well, basically, we have lots of entertainment. We have lots of distraction. We have ever shorter attention spans that kind of keep us busy and preoccupied. And you might ask, well, does that matter? Who cares if we don't have myths? What's wrong with just having entertainment instead? Well, one answer to that question comes from this guy, Carl Jung, the great psychotherapist, who argued back just before the First World War, at the end of another long period of globalization and technological innovation, that, quotes, "The man who thinks he can live without myth is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or the ancestral life within him, or yet with contemporary society." And if you look around the world today, I think you can see a lot of examples of what he's talking about. Because I think one of the things that arises in this myth gap that we have is what you might call anti-myths, things that kind of use that lack of shared myths, of the right kind of myths, to fill the space with different kind of stories. One of those anti-myths is the story that you are what you buy, that the products we consume define us and make us who we are. And if that idea sounds maybe harmless, maybe a bit abstract or metaphysical, then I think all of us in this room know that the reality of consumerism is anything but intangible. It has very concrete real-world effects. Or take another anti-myth that I think is flourishing at the moment, the myth of collapse, that we're inevitably headed for overshoot of ecological boundaries and collapse of ecosystems and of our systems that rely on them, and that we're going to end up in a situation of scarcity, where there isn't enough to go around, so we have to grab enough for ourselves before someone else gets there first. And again, if that idea sounds a bit abstract, the real world results of that story taking hold are very tangible. This is where the idea of Lebensraum came from in the 1930s, the idea there wasn't enough land to go around. And it's exactly the same idea that underlies today's phenomenon of international land grab deals, where countries that are dependent on food imports are buying up farmland in countries which export food to try and make sure that they can secure their food supply. And this is the point we really have to understand about myths. It's their power to be self-fulfilling prophecies. Because if the stories that we reach for as we head into conditions of ever greater turbulence and upheaval and crisis are stories about fragmentation rather than cohesion, about competition rather than cooperation, then there's every chance that that will become exactly the reality that we experience, because those were the stories that we reached for. This is something the novelist Terry Pratchett got 100% when he said that people think that stories are shaped by people, when in fact it's the other way around. So this is some of the stuff that I was thinking about over the 5 years after that disillusioning day at the United Nations, and it left me with a question that fascinated me and energized me, which was, what if we became myth makers? What if we reimagined our role as change agents, as campaigners, as prophets of a new future, in terms of storytelling, in terms of the right kind of myths, as the best way of beating the wrong kind of myths perpetuated by people in the marketing industry or by Donald Trump or whoever? One thing I should say at this point is that I absolutely do not think that there's one myth that we should all be aiming for, one myth that's going to enable the global transition. We've tried before to have one single story that works for everybody, and it never ends well. So I'm not suggesting we do that again. So I think we're imagining lots of different myths, but I think the kind of myths that will serve us in the transition we need to embark on will share three key features in particular. And I'll finish up by just saying a word about each of those. The first thing that we need our myths to do is help us to think of ourselves as part of a larger us. This is a rock just across the valley from where I live in North Yorkshire. You can see carved on it, there's a beautiful tree of life carving, which archaeologists think dates probably from the late Neolithic. And the thing that fascinates me is if you were part of the group of people who had carved this, your society would have been 100 or 200 people at the very most. That would have been the size of the collective that you identified with. But then, if you look at human history from then on, in one way, the whole story arc of human history is about how we kept identifying with larger and larger us's. So, a few thousand years after this, people would have been identifying with a kingdom rather than a tribe, or perhaps with a city-state. Fast forward a few more centuries, you'd have modern nation-states. And again, people identifying with that larger collective. All the way up to today, where you have staggeringly large global diasporas that cover the globe. And us alive at the most interesting moment in history, where we're perched right on the edge of identifying with a genuinely global us that includes all 7 billion of the world's people and indeed other life forms as well. This is a really, really new phenomenon. It's only 50 years since this photo, the first selfie at planetary level, was taken, and we're still kind of embedding that within us, still getting used to the idea of ourselves as part of a global us. And what fascinates me about people like Farage and Le Pen and Trump is that they explicitly set out to prevent that from happening. The thing that scares them most is the idea of all of us identifying with a larger global us. So I think our role as progressive change makers is to tackle that head on and unashamedly tell stories of that larger global us. So that's the first thing we need from our myths. The second thing I think we need them to help us with is to change the timescales we think over, to situate ourselves in a much longer now. I mentioned earlier that we've revved ourselves into these pathologically short attention spans, and now, in inverted commas, is something we measure in seconds. There's a nice story about this, which is that Danny Hillis, who's an engineer, observed that when he was a kid growing up in the 1970s, he always imagined the year 2000 as being, in some way, the future. That was when we'd all get our jetpacks and flying cars and what have you. And as time went by, each year he got a year older, and the future got a year shorter, until we passed the millennium, and now we don't have a new event horizon. We haven't said the year 3000 is the future. It's as if we've almost stopped thinking about the future altogether instead. And that has to change if we're going to be tackling issues like climate change successfully. And for an example of what that looks like, I love the story of New College in Oxford, which was founded in 1397, if memory serves. This is the college dining hall, and you can see up at the top, it's got a lovely old roof made of oak timbers. And there's a story that not so many years ago, they realized, the college fellows realized to their horror, that the timbers had woodworm, and they were going to have to replace them. And they thought, well, how are we going to tackle that? Because this is incredibly expensive wood, and it's not easy to find timber, oak timber, in those sort of lengths. And one of the junior fellows said, well, hang on, don't we, as the college, own a lot of woodland? And isn't there actually a forester who's in charge of it? Why don't we get him in and see if he's got any suggestions for where we could source this wood for the roof? So the forester duly comes in and says, well, sirs, we were wondering when you were going to be asking. And the fellow said, what? And he said, well, everyone knows that oak gets woodworm in the end. So when the college was founded 600 years ago, a stand of oaks was planted. And from forester to forester, ever since then, the word has been handed down, don't cut down those oaks, therefore when the college roof needs replacing. And that convention, that institution had lasted for 6 centuries. And so the fellows cut down those oaks, replaced the roof, and planted a new stand of oaks for the next time it needs replacing 600 years from now. That, to me, is an example of long now thinking. So that's the second thing we need from our myths. Third and finally, I think we need myths that help us to think about a different good life. At the moment, as we all know, we measure the good life in terms of growth in material consumption. If you're consuming more than you were this time last year, well, things are better. Your life is better. But what if we changed our idea of growth so that instead of measuring growth in material consumption, we were measuring the growth of our maturity as a species? I really love this quote from Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, with the idea that we're still in our sort of childlike stages as a species. And in fact, the one nuance of disagreement I have with him is that actually if you poll people around the world in all different societies and you ask them, do you feel like humanity is at its child stage of development, or adolescence, or adulthood, or old age? Actually, all over the world, majorities of people tend to say that we're in our adolescent period. And it makes a kind of intuitive sense, right? Because adolescence is a time of life when we're reckless. We don't pay attention to the consequences. We're very much about testing the limits. But it's kind of exciting to be alive at the time when we're right on the edge of our species' adulthood, ready to assume the responsibilities of adulthood, but also the opportunities that adulthood gives us to chart our own course, to write our own story rather than having someone else write it for us. So those three things, a larger us, a longer now, and a different good life, are three of the things that I think we need from myths. None of these are new ideas. They've all been around for thousands of years, embodied in very old myths, but we've lost those myths, and now we need myths back, whether it's the old ones or new ones that we co-create together. And I shall leave it there. Thanks again for having me.
I'll give it back to you in a second.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to segue into a conversation between Alex and Heather, and after that we'll open it up for comments.
Sonia, might we have both mics to start? Excuse me. That was terrific. Thank you. So I read Alex's book in preparation for coming here, and I recommend it highly. He goes into a lot. Thank you, and remind me again if I'm not. He goes into a lot more depth on several of these points, and I thought I wanted to start by bringing up an example from the anthropological record of how important storytelling is to humans. And then there were just a few points that you didn't go into in your talk that I thought we could discuss a bit before opening it up. I have this paper here that I'm happy to share if people are interested about the Agta, who are hunter-gatherer people in the Philippines, who are fisher people and hunter-gatherers. And the best predictor of success for these people, both male and female, is not how good fishermen they are or how good they are at building their houses or any number of the other metrics that you might imagine people are using, either consciously or unconsciously, but actually how good storytellers they are. So the people who tell the best stories, and the best stories are actually rich with metaphor about the future and about egalitarianism and about sustainability. That the best story, the stories which are myth at the level for the Agta, so they are stories told over and over and over again. But the people who tell the stories best and most compellingly end up with the most as measured by the other Agta. They end up with the best mates and the most children and all of the other sort of evolutionary measures that we can argue about whether or not they're actually the right measures, but they are what's the best storytellers end up with the goodies. So, yes.
Would you please slow down a bit and speak
Yes.
to the mic?
So
And how is this Agta spelled?
AGTA. And they're in the Philippines. And so the upshot there is that the best storytellers end up the most successful among the Agta. And we can presume, although there aren't a lot of other anthropological investigations into the value of storytelling in particular, that they are not alone, right? That storytelling has value across societies. So let's start with that image that you showed of the Earth. And I'd love to hear more about what you think about how that transformed first the astronauts, who first were able to view our planet from afar, and then all of us who were able to see that photograph.
Yeah. Well, there's a phenomenon that people call the overview effect. There's a guy called Frank White, who's an American academic at Princeton University, who's an expert about space, and he led the commission to find out what had happened when the Challenger space shuttle blew up. But one of the things that fascinated him was that he saw again and again that people who had been to space and orbited the Earth came back with very different perspectives. They came back thinking kind of that borders are really quite irrelevant. A lot of them came back saying, I just wish we could have political summits in space, because then leaders would just see what's important and what unites us rather than what divides us. And of course, a lot of people would date the birth of the modern environmental movement to that photograph. It had a big impact as well on awareness of ourselves as sharing this very small, very fragile planet with this thin little band of blue around it. But I think that what fascinates me is how technology is increasingly enabling us to have that experience that the astronauts had in space. I mean, if you go to your local IMAX theater, I've been to the one at the Science Museum in London, there are IMAX movies of life on the International Space Station, or of the images that you see through the Hubble Space Telescope, that can move you to tears with the beauty of those images. It's very immersive, very experiential. And there's a strong sense of we ain't seen nothing yet, because IMAX is baby steps. Once we start getting into virtual and mixed reality, we're going to have an avalanche of storytelling superpowers. There's a great story of how at the United Nations at the General Assembly last year, they set up a little stand in the lobby with virtual reality goggles that delegates could put on. And it would take them in real time to a refugee camp full of Syrian refugees. And it was an extraordinarily emotional experience for people that did it. The person who was in charge of the stand reported to the New York Times that it wasn't unusual at all to get the goggles back wet with tears. Now, the thing is that, of course, those storytelling superpowers that we're about to get are not just going to be for us. Everyone will have access to them. And, therefore, there's every prospect of their being used as much for the anti-myths, for the stories of division, rather than the ones that unite us. So we have to be ready for that battle. But I think it's all the more reason why we can't afford to stay in that campaign comfort zone of assuming that because we have good arguments or the facts and the data on our side, we'll win out. We know better than that now. So I think almost our top task right now is to become as adept in our use of stories as the opposition that we face, because time is really ticking on.
And to be clear, you're not arguing to create myth or at the more local level story that runs counter to what we understand to be true, right, but that we won't win hearts and minds, as it were, with facts and figures.
Right.
Although for some of us, for you and me, as you said, and for most people who have gone into scientific fields, we are compelled by pie charts. But most people are not, and everyone is compelled by story.
Right, and I think, this was I mentioned how climate activists got smart after the terrible defeat by the Tea Party. But you see it in Obama as well. In Obama's first term, he was very much talking about the science and talking about how if we took climate action, we'd create all these green jobs, and wouldn't that be great? And everyone just yawned. I mean, it was boring, the same way as Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports are boring too. But then in the second term, he completely changed the script, and it was much more about we have a moral responsibility to our grandchildren, and climate was a moral issue. And suddenly, that was a whole different framing, because the people who don't want to see climate action, they don't have to prove the science is wrong. They just have to sow the seeds of doubt. But you can't sow the seeds of doubt about a moral story. I mean, either it gets you here or it doesn't. And so, it's playing on a different field. But as you say, it's not at odds with the science. It's about bringing that science to life.
That's right. So you talk also in the book about the role of grief, something that you brought up, I think, on the first day of this conference as well. And I'm interested to hear more about how often in Western societies we imagine now, in the last 20, 30 years, that happiness is a goal, just like the dominant economic paradigm imagines that growth is a goal. And happiness, increasingly, most people are understanding, cannot be a stable goal, is in fact an absurd goal for any long-term system. So what role then does grief play in our myth-making, in our stories?
Well, there's a guy called Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament theologian, a bit of a kind of theological rock star, if there is such a thing. And he wrote a book recently arguing that if you look at the Old Testament prophets, they basically have three jobs. One job is just telling it like it is, holding up a mirror to societies and saying, this is what you've become, and really engendering that sense of outrage. And so if you look at like the book of Jeremiah, very much in that kind of space. The second job they have is about channeling grief, about really expressing society's grief. And the book of Lamentations is that par excellence. And then the third part is about expressing hope. And the book of Isaiah is all about expressing hope for kind of return from the exile in Babylon. Now, when you fast forward to today, Brueggemann observes that if you look at today's progressive campaigners, they're awesome at the outrage, they're great at the hope, they absolutely can't do the grief. We never bring it into our campaigning. It's as if we're afraid to kind of bring the personal in and be vulnerable. But when it happens, it's incredibly powerful. People who were at a particular climate summit, I think it was somewhere between Paris and Copenhagen, but there was the delegate, I mean, you know, if you've been to a climate summit, goodness me, these are boring occasions, and bringing emotion into the room, absolutely not okay. Nobody does it. It was Bali, that's right, thank you. You're already there. So we're thinking of the Philippine lead negotiator, and there'd just been a terrible typhoon, Typhoon Haiyan, which had just... Thank you, all right, Warsaw. All right. Okay. Anyway, the point was that the Philippine negotiator was describing the devastation that this typhoon had wrought on the Philippines. And in the process of doing so, just broke down in tears, absolutely sobbing in a full United Nations plenary. It was unheard of, and it transformed the energy in the room. Suddenly people came out a little bit from behind their talking points and became willing to actually connect. And I don't want to overstate it. It didn't suddenly lead to a global deal 10 minutes later. But it did in that instant transform the energy in the room, and everybody in that room felt it and found it remarkable and was still talking about it after the summit. So when we bring grief in, there is this raw power to it, and we're missing out on something by overlooking that in our campaigning.
There's a depth of emotion to grief that we are generally not allowed to incorporate into our public lives. And because of the nature of grief being something that, when it's about an individual that we've lost, you don't actually control how you're experiencing it at a time. And it comes in waves, and it can overcome you 1 minute, and 10 minutes later you can be doing your work, right? So feeling free, perhaps, to feel grief about more global things, and to express that grief will help us tell those stories.
And at some level, people get that. I mean, there's a reason why Brené Brown's TED Talk on vulnerability is the most viewed TED Talk of all time. At some level, we know there's a depth we're not connecting to and that we want access back. And Myth is about that too.
That's right. So you talk as well in your book about Jubilee, about actual Jubilee from the New Testament and its role as sort of an extended Sabbath, and how we might extend that idea into a broader context. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so lots of us remember the Jubilee 2000 debt relief campaign, this huge, very successful campaign 18 years ago to write off all developing world debt. And that drew on this very old biblical idea of Jubilee. And what that was about was that we're all familiar with the idea of Sabbath, that once a week there was supposed to be a day of rest. And that also applied once every 7 years. Every 7th year was a Sabbath year, where the idea was no crops would be sown, the land would lie fallow and recharge, everyone would go back home and rest and just live off what the land produced naturally. And then every 7 Sabbaths, so every 49 or 50 years, every 7 Sabbath years, there would be a Jubilee. And at that point, all debts would be cancelled, all slaves would be free, all land ownership would be reset as well and redistributed. And what you have there, embedded very much in a mythical kind of set of stories, and in this deep idea of a kind of covenant that holds everything together, was basically a set of actions for having a reboot of wealth ownership once every 50 years to prevent unsustainable concentrations of wealth from building up, and understanding the absolute indivisibility of taking action to protect the social side of creation with protecting the natural side of creation too. It's this very, very kind of rich idea, and it fascinates me that 2,000 years later, Jubilee 2000 was able to use it to such great effect. But the debt cancellation was just one little sliver of it. And I think if we start getting into areas like, what if we had land value taxes? What if we had wealth transfer taxes to try and bring about a modern day Jubilee? That would be incredibly interesting as an agenda and a set of actions.
Indeed. So finally, I think I'd love to focus on enemy narratives and the role that enemy narratives have played in history, how easy they are to adopt, and how we might move past them in order to, and we've heard about some of this, at least maybe it's just small conversations that I've been part of, where we need to find the yes, where it's easier to find the no.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've talked already about political polarization. I worry about it enormously in the context of climate change, because people at our end of the political spectrum are pretty fired up by climate change. And people at the other end of the spectrum hate it as an issue. And actually, if you look at polling data in America, climate is the single best predictor of where you are on the left-right political spectrum. It's more accurate than what you think about capital punishment or guns or abortion. It is the most divisive issue. And the problem with that is that climate change is just too big an issue to be solved by one end of the political spectrum being fired up and aiming to just basically defeat the other end. Everybody at some level has to be on board with the solution. And so my worry about climate activism now, which I think in some ways is in great condition, as I mentioned, it's got these stories, it's got a movement, it's out there making stuff happen, but it's not reaching over that political divide. And I think to get to where we need to get to, we've absolutely got to figure out how to do that. We're not going to win this by defeating Republicans. We're going to win this by taking them with us. And we haven't really figured out how to do that. But I worry that the more we fire up our base to campaign on climate change, the more we're firing up an equal and opposite reaction from the other end of the spectrum. And so the two end up canceling each other out. And I don't know yet how we change that dynamic.
Well, in the case of climate change, I'd like to talk more broadly about enemy narratives and what we can put in their place. But in the case of climate change, I think that part of the problem is that, as in any scientific field, some of the science is bad, right? Some of the findings are built on bad assumptions. Some of the methods are poor. Some of the scientists are not being honest about what they did. This is true in any population, and so of course it will be true among climate scientists and in climate science. And that can be used against the reality of anthropogenic climate change and say, but this model here doesn't make sense. And unfortunately, I think many on the left, many among progressives say, but this is so important that I can't tolerate any pushback against any piece of evidence that looks like it supports the idea of anthropogenic climate change. And I would say what we need is, again, not the enemy narrative of, but those people who disagree are wrong and they have to sit down and shut up. But rather, those people who are pointing out problems with some of the science may be right, but that doesn't mean that the overwhelming evidence doesn't suggest very, very strongly that we have a problem that we need to address globally. And that is again, this issue of coming back to, look at that planet. Look, it's not up there now, but look at that planet that we all share, and there's not another one, right? Despite some people's interest in making Mars livable, it's not going to be good, right? This is our planet, and change is happening, and it's our fault and our problem to solve. But we should not pretend that some of the results aren't flawed. So, what then do we do? What kinds of alternative narratives are there?
Right. Well, this is where, I guess it would be great to open it up maybe, because it's a year since I published The Myth Gap. And I still feel happy with it as a diagnosis, as a kind of call to arms to say, this is why stories matter. But I feel like it really didn't get that far into prescription, that, if you're convinced by the power of storytelling, as I definitely am. So what then do we do about it? And I guess there's two levels of that question for me. Partly it's about how we integrate it into our campaigning. I just finished a year as a campaign director at a VARS, and it was a great training experience for me, because although I'd just written this book about, hey, we should tell stories, I had to be reminded constantly by my line manager, stop writing these wonky campaign emails and find the emotive core and talk from there. So I think, I have to have that reminder myself. So there's a question about how we... I think it's gone off. So I think there's a question about how we apply it in our campaigning. But then I think there's a deeper question, which comes back to how we bridge the political divide, or this polarization, which is really about how we come up with collective stories, how we tell stories together. When I was at Avars, the thing that I spent most time on was leading our work on Brexit, where our objective was very simple. It was basically to defy the result of the referendum and secure a Remain outcome after all, so that Britain never leaves the European Union. And the thing that bothered me, kept me up at night, to be honest, was that I can relatively easily imagine a scenario where we win remaining in the EU after all. But I can also imagine with that it just toxifies British politics for a generation, that it throws the far right, the biggest bone they could have imagined, and emboldens them, and we end up with something much worse and much darker than Brexit 5 years down the line. And it seems to me like the way we move past that risk, the way we kind of heal this divide and bring our polity back together in Britain, in Europe, globally, ultimately, on all of these issues, is through collective storytelling processes. Things that allow us all to feel heard, like we are all authors of this story or set of stories, that understand kind of, you know, the traumas that have led to the divisions that we see in front of us now, and start to heal that. And I do not know what those processes look like. I can think of a few, just a handful of kind of scenario planning exercises, like the one that was in South Africa, just as it was transitioning out of apartheid, which were very influential in creating a set of shared understandings about where the country was and where it might be trying to get to. But these are just outliers. There's just a handful. And I would love to talk together about what would it look like if we understood part of our role as helping to create space for those shared stories, so that we have not one myth that works for everyone, but not a cacophony of different stories where we're all just talking past each other, but we manage somehow to achieve that synthesis of unity and diversity, that we all come together in our wonderful diversity, but manage also to agree on some things, such that our society coheres and can decide who we are at a global level and where it is we're trying to get to. That feels to me like the single biggest task facing us as a species, and I would love to spend some time talking about that together.
So thank you so much. We're going to close up the circle and spend a little bit of time talking about the invitation that Alex has just made. So let's come into a circle so that we can have an easier dialogue. So do you want to just maybe just throw out your question again to...
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it again in the shorter version. So how can we be change agents for enabling a kind of collective storytelling that brings us together without obviating the really valuable and precious things that make us different from each other? How do we achieve that unity and diversity through storytelling?
So we'll pass the mic round. We don't necessarily need to do a back and forth because we're interested to hear from you. So it looked like we had Wolfgang, Vincent, and Job.
I think that one story we tell in every single election and every single referendum is one side wins and the other side loses. And I think we can still tell different stories and make these events tell different stories. One thing that I would have loved in the referendum about the Brexit, and many different referenda actually, is to have a voting process where everybody can rate several different alternatives. So you could look at the Brexit and everything is just the same as it is today. I think that's what many people favoring the Brexit thought that it would look like. But you can also have a Brexit with the scenario that foreign trade breaks down, or a Brexit that free movement of British citizens to the continent is disrupted. Yeah, to rate several different alternatives. And I think that would show that many people who imagined that the Brexit would be a wonderful thing would not want a Brexit which actually disrupted their lives in various ways. And then the expectation from the politicians would be that they would try to get the best possible Brexit, but if that wasn't possible, that maybe a non-Brexit would be preferable to so many British people that if they didn't get that best of all possible Brexits, they would decide not to do a Brexit, and that would actually be supported by the referendum. So if you have voting methods, especially in referenda, that allow this kind of a differentiated view of what people want, it could lead to a much greater sense that there are some things that all of the people agree on. And then it would tell a different story about what happened.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation and to bring this debate here. I like to be a bit provocative. I think is our mission, our goal to sell the right myth to the people or the right narrative which will be working, or to, on the contrary, emancipate the people in a way that they have intellectual protections to any kind of myth, to be autonomous and self-create? What are meaningful myths towards the 21st century challenges what we face? And the second point is that I think the main goal is not to win election, because it's far away from being enough, but to push for cultural victory or cultural transformation of the society, so connected to the first point. And I think here, if you observe who is voting for Marine Le Pen or Brexit or Macron, and you talk to these people, you will have as many different reasons as people voting for this type of things. And how to have a strategy to create type of dialogue, bridges, and trusts, because most of the reason people are voting, it's most of the time against and dealing with fear, and not following type of narrative or type of empowering and meaningful stories behind.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex, for coming here and also posing this really good question. Let me just, because now we're sort of in a European bubble here. Most of, so let me just read up something from Robert Manasse, I think, is a German author. Manasse, Austrian, yes. So, because I think that's kind of relevant to what I'm trying to say. My experience is that most people get bored if you tell them the story of the EU, even if you keep it short. I am a fan of this kind of boredom because I do not want to tell myself or anyone else the doubtlessly exciting story that would come with the collapse of the EU. And I really like the aspect about grief. I think there is another aspect which he's talking about here, which is celebrate what we've got. And we're also in an NGO bubble here, and I think we realize that inside Greenpeace very much, that we love to exploit multilateral institutions like the EU, for example, but we never actually celebrate the fact that they exist, what they bring to us, and maybe that is also an answer to the question around we're always voting against something, because we don't give time ourselves to tell the story of what we have. And I think if you look back to ancient stories and myths, that's another element which we find missing in our own stories, that we actually really value and somehow crack that. I know it's difficult, and don't believe me, in Greenpeace we are struggling with this enemy narrative ourselves big time. But I just feel that without the grief and without the celebration bit, we were not going to be able to break that bubble. Thank you.
You were talking about the permission to bring in emotion. So I feel like I feel very touched by what I'm hearing right now.
So I wanted to share something. One of the telling stories or knowing what stories to tell is also the art of listening first to other stories and getting in different perspectives. And so Friends of the Netherlands, we realized that we were on a bad foot with farmers in Holland. They really did not like us. And at some point we said, okay, we just need to go and talk to them. So we trained 100 volunteers to go from farm to farm and just listen and truly listen to their stories. And we had 200 amazing conversations with organic farmers, big factory farmers, all kinds of different farmers. And that shaped a lot of common narrative. We found shared values and we created great stories together, and that helps us now in the future in finding also what are the myth gaps together, and so I just want to offer that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your input. It's been really interesting. I'm a campaigner myself, so I tell stories all the time, and climate change would be one of the main themes that I work on. So just 2 points that I wanted to make, just to reinforce your example of grief and how, I guess, or even emotions and how impactful they can be. One of the things that we're doing in Ireland is trying to be much more localized in our campaigning work, so encouraging our supporters to meet directly with their local politicians, and we see that as being really very impactful and possibly a lot more impactful than just the large petition e-action kind of approach, while all of them have their place. But we just have one example of a few local politicians who are about to debate divestment in our parliament, and a grandfather stood up and he just broke through all of the technical jargon that we were talking about in terms of fossil fuels and carbon, etc. And he just stood up and talked about his grandchildren and what he was leaving for them and what he was worried we were all going to leave for them. And a politician that was in the room went on to have the debate in the committee that was dealing with the bill that we were pushing for, and he referenced that grandfather, and it completely changed his mind, he said. So it's just to reinforce that point about people's personal stories, be they people from the politician's local environment or someone from the south. They're incredibly important. And just the second point, which is kind of linked, is that, so I'm a campaigner, I tell stories, we work in developing countries, so usually my stories about climate change are how our actions or the lack of political will in Ireland is impacting people in developing countries. So we constantly want to tell that story, but we're finding ourselves having to move towards, instead of talking about the impact on developing countries, talking about the impact for people in Ireland in order to get through to them, which is I'm finding really challenging, and I'm wondering if other people are having the same dilemma, because I find it really difficult to talk to someone about, the need to put pressure on our politicians to be more ambitious about climate change because of the effect on you, as opposed to the effect on communities in developing countries. So I'll leave it there, but that's something that I'm struggling with, because I think it's probably the direction we need to go, but I find it quite unauthentic when we're leaving out those stories about developing countries.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit getting more and more afraid about the use of narratives, because I feel like it's turning into a quite manipulative communication tool, actually. I was really hopeful when this first came up as an idea, since I had the sense that with a narrative you try to kind of make sense of complexity in a different way than just one way, basically. So this is maybe just reiterating what has been come up already, but for me, there's an opportunity in that word still to create not just a one-way communication, but shared experience and maybe also sense of emotion and feeling that connects people beyond what we can maybe make sense just in words, if that makes sense.
Okay. The people whose hands are up, are those the remaining people who want to talk, or does anybody else? I'm just trying to get a sense of how many comments we want. Okay, well, I'm going to suggest another 10, 15. Does that 10, 15 minutes? Does that sound about right? So we'll have two here, one here, and one here.
I first like to thank you. It was very inspiring. I agree with, I think, all of you, what you said. And I was reminded of the preparation paper. We need a narrative that doesn't alienate the somewheres. And you mentioned it, like we can only get to winning on climate change if we get the Republicans with us. So I was hoping we can maybe, what would that narrative look like? Get out a few keywords and see if that floats or if there is resistance to that. How far do we have to go in hijacking the narrative used by the Trumps in this world? And I have a couple of the ideas, just 3 of them that I want to just test to see, is there a huge resistance to using them? Because I'm a communicator and I doubt if I should use them or not. One is, for example, safe operating space. It appeals to the need for security for people who are afraid of everything. A safe operating space is like in the donut from Kate Raworth. But that will be explained only later. I think it's a word that appeals even to conservatives, the ones that we have to try to win over somehow, safe operating space. Another is, well, make our food and air great again. It's maybe even more controversial. Should we be using that? I think he had a point. I mean, Hillary was campaigning on let's make us whole again, and he was campaigning on let's make us great again. And great, it sounds apparently a lot better. Do we have to hijack that word and use it in our benefit, make our air great again? And another one is ecological protectionism. I once published an opinion piece on that. It created a bit of a discussion among the Greens because there were some who were saying, yeah, finally we have to take that word back again from the right-wing conservatives who've used protectionism in a nationalistic way. While protect is what we want, no? We want to give protection. And that appeals to the level of fear and that a lot of these somewheres experience through globalization. But we want it for another motive, another reason, for ecological reasons. And maybe it means different things than what it means for Trump. I'm pretty sure of that. But using this terminology, you capture the attention, I think, of the people that are not in this room and that we want to get with us. So how do others think about that? How do you think about that?
I just want to add in the sense of not having these evil narratives that are framed by a few only. I mean, that's again this diversity of voices that we actually should and want to hear. And I think, you know, the idea of storytelling is like super present in, for example, indigenous cultures and, you know, like making space for these stories to be actually heard. And I think what can we do from our side is have more solidarity narratives and stories and myths instead of, again, sorry to use that word again, elite explanation just packaged in a different story, you know, like trying to sell our science in another way. You know, I think that's not the way to do it, but like really have real stories emerge and give space for them. And I think a good example for that is in Australia, the LGBT movement, how they actually got the right to equal marriage by sharing, just like allowing people to say, okay, like we just want our love to be expressed in the way you express your love. And it's a very positive, hopeful story that a lot of people could agree with that otherwise would maybe say, you know, I don't support the LGBT movement and the violence that sometimes they feel is expressed against them. But that was a very, very positive, hopeful story that actually worked really well.
I wanted to pick up on the question of how narratives get co-opted, how stories get co-opted. It's very easy, so I know the American system best, of course, and it's very easy and legitimate to point fingers at Trump and his abuse of narrative and his abuse of narrative to win votes. But Clinton did the same thing, and so she may have run on she pretended to be about making America whole again as opposed to great again. But a comment that I think reached outside of American borders, which she made a month or so before the election, in which she referred to the people who would vote for Trump as a basket of deplorables, went pretty viral, and of course re-entrenched all of his supporters. And it hasn't stopped. She has doubled down on this narrative that anyone who voted for Trump is a racist and a misogynist and a horrible human being. And it's hardly going to make us whole again, right? And in fact, what we actually know, and here's where, we can start with the facts and then figure out how to build an inclusive story around it, is that there were a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who made the leap to Trump. Now, I can't imagine making that leap myself, having been devastated by Clinton's ouster of Sanders, but there were a lot of people who saw a problem with the system, saw Clinton as the imminent insider, and would not vote for an insider no matter what. And so for her to be making the claim that anyone who voted for another outsider, granted himself apparently a narcissistic psychopath, but that anyone who voted for him was doing so because they hate people, simply creates more division. So we need these stories that are actually based on what is true about people, and to be actually inclusive instead of, and you won't speak, and you won't speak, and all of you, I know what you think because of how you acted.
I'd like to encourage people to, if not to repeat themes that have already come up, so if you'd like to contribute something new or a different perspective on what we're discussing. Okay, 1, 2, 3,
4. Alex, thanks very much. Appreciate your presentation and look forward reading your book. I like your succinct 3 aspects of what could be the new ways of creating the narrative, the long now and the story of us and all of that. So that's great. I think we here, we have a challenge, which is to craft this new myth, or new myths, not maybe one, but maybe different ones. So it's a challenge for us to begin to write those new myths that make sense. And I think in some ways, science, and I'm a believer of science and evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. For example, the evidence is that we are all one family, scientifically. We're one sapiens. How do we, I remember, I don't know who said it, but it's like, we are all Africans. We all came from Lucy. And so Kenya, I believe, somewhere in there, East Africa. So how could we tell the story that we are all Africans? And, I tell that to people, even Africans, when I tell them that, they, no, I'm not African, I'm Kikuyu. I'm Kikuyu, I'm Swahili. And no, you are African. We are all the same. And so how could we tell that evidence, of scientific evidence, but in a way that is appealing and myth-making, as opposed to just the facts, that we're 99.9 the same, right? So I see this as a great challenge for us. Secondly, in my work as evolutionary leadership, which is what I teach in my institute, we teach evolutionary leaders to be conscious and mindful of the power of emotions and language. because we as human beings are emotions and language creatures. We cannot live without myth. We cannot live without a story that makes sense to us. If we don't have a good one, we'll make one up. I mean, that's what we've been doing for hundreds of years. Sometimes really bad stories. You know, we are the chosen people and you're not, right? For example. So we do have as a great transition, a great challenge to craft a new myth in that sense. And it would be great to have the opportunity here even to take a shot at it this afternoon, you know, maybe 20 minutes, you know, what if we could collectively, you know, write something? That would be great. Finally, I just want to say that, for example, I was disappointed that, I mean, I read a lot and I believe a lot of talking about climate change. Naomi Klein, for example, her book, This Will Change Everything. I mean, what a great title, right? This will change everything. Capitalism versus climate. Well, how many people read that book? I did, and I'm glad to see other people read it. I mean, I thought, wow, once people read this book, they have to act on this. Well, it didn't work, at least for a lot of Americans, you know. So there's a great potential there in Naomi Klein, but evidence-based, but it didn't seem to get the job done. And finally, you know, at least going back to America, I know I'm from the US, and we do have 40 to 50 million fundamentalists there, and they live by a very powerful narrative, you know, the Christian narrative, and those people vote and they organize. So I see as a big challenge, how do you in some way enhance that narrative with the greater picture of the earth, because those people definitely are very powerfully wedded to that myth of Christianity, for example, fundamentalism Christianity. And I think people underestimate that there are 50 million Americans who vote for Trump too, based on what the pastor says, you will vote for this fellow. And people do it. I mean, so there's a, you know, there's a politics and religion and narrative and myth. So there's a systemic complexity there in the American culture and maybe in other cultures. Thank you.
Well, I'm a professor as well, and I have to admit, I'm not completely convinced yet. Of course, myth matters, but there's also the danger of overestimating this factor. And by the way, I'm also quite critical about Naomi Klein. I wrote a critical review on capitalism versus climate in one of the German national newspapers, but I think I cannot elaborate on this point here for time reasons. Just 4 short remarks on myth. The first one is, in behavioral science, of course, we know for decades or even centuries that human motivation is not only driven by knowledge. It's also about egoistic calculations about values, concepts of normalities, emotions, etc., etc. And of course, myth has the potential to shape or reshape these factors. But I think we have to be more precise on that and, for instance, make the distinction between the factors I mentioned. The second remark is, as we can learn from history, not all myths function as well as others do. For instance, the Trump myth, the Brexit myth, and the Nazi myth in the 1930s functioned quite well. But this does not finally prove that ecological myth function as well, because this Nazi myth or Trump myth in a way address some very deep emotions of human beings rooted in our evolutionary history, and it's not as easy to do the same with universal orientations or values. My third remark is to evaluate the power of myth. It could be helpful to apply the insight that myth matters on oneself. And for instance, have a look at the climate, the Paris Climate Agreement. Article 2, Section 1 of the Paris Agreement establishes the legally binding target to limit global warming compared to pre-industrial level to well below 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius. So given the IPCC data, this requires 0 emissions in all sectors in 1 to 2 decades worldwide. Given that power-to-gas technologies do not function yet, this means you will not live in Ethiopia anymore, or maybe you will live there but never come to Paris or UK or USA. And you know the myth. Is this what you will do? Will you completely stop flying? Will anyone in this room do this? Maybe some in this room, but go to the streets and ask other people. And even in this room, this will be difficult and it will get worse when you go outside. My fourth and last remark is, by the way, I don't even have a driving license. Yeah, I try to be as radical as I propose here, but never mind. I know for an American must sound very funny not to have a driving license, but anyway. My fourth and last remark is, it is so typical for all these international actors and books that deal with climate and revolution and transformation and so on, always to have a big focus on the USA. I just want to make the very maybe a very simple remark. The USA is just one of 200 countries in this world, and please don't believe that Europeans, I'm European, I'm from Germany, are perfect about climate protection. Angela Merkel, yeah, is like celebrated all over the world, but have a look at the German ecological footprint per capita, and this is what matters. Or have a look at the upper classes in China or India and Brazil, and I'm pretty sure they don't want to hear your myth. They want to hear the American dream, driving a big car, watching TV, going by plane like every day. And this is also the reason why, for instance, Agora, as a Nobel Prize laureate, wasn't as successful as we might hope. Yeah, he told a nice myth, a nice story, but everyone knows he has a house with 25 rooms, goes by plane like 3 times a week, and so on and so forth. What I believe is, if you really want to reshape egoistic calculations, values, concepts of normalities and emotions, what is even more important than a myth is role models. You need people that really convince by what they are doing, not what they're telling.
Okay, we're going to have one last comment, and then I'll pass it back to Alex if you'd like to sum up.
I don't have a comment. I have questions, and thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. My questions are around how to make myths successful in terms of spreading them and getting people to really buy into them. So a couple of questions like, do they need to be satisfying psychological needs? And Heather, what are the theories about evolutionary processes? How can that help myths take hold and also evolve? Do they need to be showing those 4 elements that you and Brett displayed on the screen yesterday? You talked about evoking particular grief. Do we need to be making sure our myths are evoking other emotions, and what are those emotions? And you also touched on experiences in terms of internalizing stories, like the VR experience, and are there other experiences that we should be setting up or structuring our environment? So once we tell the people these stories, how can we reinforce them so they stick and that people believe them more and more? Do we need to be setting up our public transport system so they're reflecting these stories back to us, like images or words? So even subtly, those stories are being reinforced. And no, I think that was it. Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you. I guess for reasons of time, I can't reply to all the questions, although they're great questions. But I guess just a sort of closing thought instead. I think you asked about what does that story look like that can bring Republicans on board. And it made me think of the point in your talk yesterday, Heather, about non-zero sum versus zero sum games. And there's a book I love called Non-Zero by Robert Wright, who's he's into evolutionary biology and also game theory. And his point is that through human history, the dice were kind of loaded in favor of non-zero sum cooperation, because sometimes people cooperate because there's an opportunity, like they trade with each other. But also they sometimes cooperate because there's a threat against them. And that these two things have driven larger and larger scales of cooperation. But he continues, now we're at this problematic situation where, poised as we are on the edge of a global civilization and really in danger from global threats like climate change, we don't have an enemy to unite against. I mean, he says, only half tongue-in-cheek, the best thing that could happen now would be if aliens tried to invade us, because that would certainly catalyze a planetary level consciousness. But without that, we're dealing with the much more difficult stuff. Like, we are the enemy may be us. And so how do we sort of find our way through that? And thinking about that some more, I mean, if things like trade or conflict are what's driven non-zero sum cooperation through human history, these are both basically about growth. Growth in consumption, growth in territory. And you mentioned indigenous myths, and of course those kind of myths are completely different. They're not about growth, they're about how you maintain a healthy, steady state. They're stories about balance. I mean, if I think of the kind of creation theology in very early Judaism, it's very much built on the idea that creation is a tapestry. We're part of that tapestry, we're not separate from it. And if people kind of undermine the covenant through ignorance or injustice, they're pulling threads from that tapestry, and too much of that, the whole thing unravels, and all of creation is at risk. And that's what the original symbolism of atonement rituals was all about. That's how you repair the tapestry. And so that raises for me the question of, like, well, where can we find those myths? And as you say, we can find them in lots of indigenous societies, but of course there we run headlong into the risk of cultural appropriation. Those aren't our myths, and if we decide to try and make them ours, we're going to run into all sorts of trouble. And it makes me think of a point the Dalai Lama has always said, which is that, like, it's great that you guys in the West are also interested in Buddhism, but you kind of have your own traditions and you should explore those. And I think there's a question then about, well, what would it mean to do that? Because I have massive issues with Christianity. I was brought up a Christian. There's a lot of stuff I think is deeply problematic about it. You know, starting with the fact that it's so completely patriarchal, obviously. But I think it's kind of like, you know, it's also, we've got the opportunity to reappropriate those myths. Those are our myths that have been kind of debased and rewritten over time by people with agendas. You can do the kind of biblical detective work and actually see revisionist patriarchal narratives being put in. And so I think kind of reclaiming those myths. I mean, if you go all the way back to the myth of the fall, I mean, that is, to me, the original patriarchal myth. It's basically, it's all women's fault. Everything that happened since then in history that's wrong is Eve's fault. And it's a kind of, you know, the church has fed on that for a long time, the sense that it's all women's fault. But we can reclaim that myth. I mean, I think there's an opportunity to say, you know what, the fall was great. That was the beginning of our self-consciousness as a species. But now we have to realize the consequences of some of what we're doing and grow up and take our rightful place as co-creators. And I mean, that's just one example. You may or may not go for that. But I think taking that kind of bedrock of these stories, not in their religious context, but just as reference points we all know, and reclaiming them and refashioning them for the kind of changes we want to see, for the people we want to be, that feels like an area that's got a lot of potential. So thank you for this great discussion. It's been lots and lots of fun, and I've got lots to take away. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. There's obviously a huge amount of interest